What's up? Welcome. Good morning. Sorry for being a couple minutes tardy there, a couple minutes late, but had a couple tech issues on the side here. I'm going to fix that in just a second. It looks like that's all done. So I think we're good to go. I think despite my chaotic tech issue that I just had, which I was trying to fix, I think we're all set. So thank you everybody for your patience. I'm just going to make sure that I also have the chat window up here on the side. So thanks guys for being here. Thanks for your patience. As you guys will be aware, and as I see you guys are aware from the conversation in the chat, we're going to talk a little bit about some preflop adaptations and some exploits today when it comes to what we would refer to, I guess, as non-GTO opponents, or opponents that we think are going to be making some mistakes, opponents who are, exploitable, let's say. And I think there's a couple of pretty important key principles that we always want to keep in mind for these things. I do think it's easy to get caught up in kind of forgetting about some of the basics of how poker works, really, right? In that it's quite easy to forget that certain things are just going to kind of generally be accurate or true or correct when it comes to things like being able to get value from worse hands, being able to get better hands to fold. All of these things are very fundamental to poker as a whole, and they contribute significantly to our EV in various cases, well, really in all cases for the most part. So we want to keep the focus on that. And we want to keep the focus on specifically where our EV is coming from with the different parts of our range, and anticipating a response and anticipating, maybe a different range that we're up against to what we normally would be is going to be a big part of the process as well. So there's really those two parts to the whole thing. It's, my opponent has already taken an action, and I think that action is coming from a different range than what it should be. And then the second part is I expect my opponent to take different actions once I take an action, right? So you're kind of looking at reactive exploits and proactive exploits is the way that I would tend to refer to them. And we'll start by looking at what I would refer to as a reactive exploit. We'll start by looking at if my opponent is employing a different range than what they are quote unquote supposed to, different range to GTO, how do we respond to that? Now, by the way, I want to make sure you guys are hearing me and everything okay, so let me know if there's any issues with the audio. I'm just going to type in chat as well. Let me know if you guys are hearing me okay. So we're going to dive into the first sim. We're just going to look at, let's say we're going to actually take a pretty realistic sim here. We're just going to look at one of our uneven stacked sims that are fairly deep. Audio is perfect. Okay, great. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. That is good to hear. So what I want to start with is just kind of picking up a sim here that is sort of standard uneven stack, fairly deep, and just thinking about a type of response that we might have, right? We've got let's say we're looking at this under the gun player here. They've got 29 big blinds. This is the range that they're supposed to have as they're under the gun open, right? And let's say we were in a position where we would think that, well, I want to know approximately how to respond when I'm in this same sort of a situation, but my opponent is too tight. Well, it's a little bit tricky when they're coming from under the gun 8, because of course that's the tightest position at an 8-handed table. So this maybe is a difficult starting point if they're actually going to be tighter than this. But even so, even if they're tighter than this and they're employing a range that, isn't part of the whole, it isn't really part of any sort of GTO strategy. What you can do is you can look at where the EV is coming from different hands and start to shift them around based on that. So let's say we were looking at this player raising here for 2 big blinds, and they are going to be raising with a tighter range than this. So we can't just kind of shift their position, and we actually have to just kind of, we have to really kind of be creative and have to think about the details of their strategy, right? The first thing, let's say we're going to figure out this under the gun 7 strategy, right? We have 80 big blinds here. We're trying to figure out how we're going to play against this player who's a bit shallower. The first thing to figure out is, from this particular strategy, where is the EV coming from for the different parts of this range, right? And the easiest way to look at that is to see what the under the gun 8 player is going to do versus the 3-bet here, right? So if we looked at, let's say, the 3-bet range first of all, just highlight the 3-bet range here. What's happening in this situation is that the under the gun 7 player, has a lot of hands that are 3-betting that they're kind of in a sort of unclear territory. They're sort of semi-bluffs, or they're kind of, there's a few merging effects that are taking place where they're getting better hands to fold, but also getting worse hands to call. But in general, you can see quite clearly here that one of the things that's taking place is that a lot of these pocket pairs, the reason why these hands are 3-betting is because they have the ability to get shoved on by ace-5 or ace-4 suited. And of course, if they do get shoved on, they're just going to call, right? The 10s plus is a clear call here in this spot. It is actually interesting. I'm a little surprised to see that a hand like 7s, 8s, 9s are not always calling here, but they are mixing calls. So, that's kind of a symptom there of the fact that they are a bit closer. It's only the ace-5 and the ace-4 that they're actually ahead of. But what we would want to think about is, if the initial response is going to be tighter, what are the hands that, first of all, are going to drop out of having any incentive to 3-bet? Because the hands that are going to drop out are going to be the ones that are the most borderline to begin with, right? So most likely, we're going to see stuff like this ace-8 suited, right? You can see which is exactly 0 EV against this initial range. If that range is too tight, then that 0 EV is going to become negative EV. King, queen off, ace-jack off, same thing. Jack 10-9 suited. All of those hands that are 0 EV against this 18% range, if that range goes down to 15, 12%, something like that, those hands are definitely going to become losing hands, right? And the hands that are slightly plus EV already as a 3-bet are potentially going to decrease in EV to the point where they become close to 0. So let's look at like King 10 suited, right? King 10 suited is making 15 or 0.15, 15% of a big blind as a 3-bet. But if that range is tighter, then it's likely that that's going to go down to pretty close to 0, right? So what happens is our hands that are basically the bottom of our 3-bet range drop out of the range, and we should just fold them. And then the hands that are kind of in the middle of our 3-bet range, where they're bluffing, but they do capture some EV because there's some of those merging effects going on, they now would drop out. In particular, because what's supposed to happen, as you can see, is that we're supposed to be able to 3-bet King Jack suited, King 10 suited, and first of all, get King Jack off to fold, get Ace Jack off to fold, but also get King 9 suited to call, get King 8 suited to call even sometimes. And if none of those things are happening, if villain doesn't have King Jack off to begin with, they don't open King 8 suited, or maybe they fold King 9 or King 8 suited to the 3-bet, all of those things are going to combine to make the EV of that King 10 suited a lot lower. It's not going to be anywhere close to the same EV, and it might be negative EV to the point where we should just fold it against an opponent that's tight enough here. So generally speaking, the hands are going to shift in their and how they're ranked, right? The hands that go from the bottom of the 3-bet range, to being a fold, hands that go from the kind of the middle of the 3-bet range, or having kind of some ability to 3-bet bluff, those are now going to become hands that maybe are the very bottom of our 3-bet range. And then the bottom of our value range is also going to shift as well. You can see that hands like 9s, 8s, and 7s here are going to be in that category where they're mixing some 3-bets because they do technically have the ability to get it in. They have the ability to get shoved on by ace-5 and ace-4. If all those things are not happening, then they're going to have a lot less reason to 3-bet as well, right? So a lot of the deviations or the changes that can happen in our 3-bet range are going to occur just as a simple product of these hands no longer having the same incentives that they did before. You know, they can't, King 10 suited can no longer get King Jack off to fold because King Jack off isn't in the range, right? Or even Ace Jack off, maybe Ace Jack off isn't even in the range here. So immediately we can start to see, you know, some fairly straightforward things there as far as the shifting around of hands that exist in our 3-bet range. That's one thing. But what if our opponent is maybe a bit too wide? What if maybe they are wider than what they're supposed to? So Yana says, how do you define the bottom of the 3-bet range? Good question. It's going to be the hands that are the closest to 0 EV. So it's not necessarily how often you take that action. Sometimes it can be. Sometimes you are going to see 3-bet ranges that have these small slivers of 3-betting with certain hands, but generally it's the hands that are closest to 0 in EV, right? And if you hover over the EVs here, you can see what those are. So something like Ace 9 suited is fairly close to the bottom because it's making 0.08 big blinds. Ace 10 is making 0.3 big blinds, right? So Ace 10 is definitely a lot further away from the bottom than Ace 9 suited is. You know, Jack 10 suited is going to be in there as well. These hands are all mixing. But they're all making the same EV as a call as they are as a 3-bet, and that's why they're mixing. So it's the stuff that's closest to 0 EV, basically. And now if we want to think about what happens if villain is opening wider, well, it's quite tricky to replicate the exact situation because we would have to kind of move all of the stacks one position later here. But if I go to the even stack sims, and I take a look just at a basic 60 big blinds, let's say something like this, right? The simplest thing that you can do here if your opponent is opening wider is you can just treat them like they are one position later, right? You can just treat them like they are moving around the table. So if I think my opponent is too wide from under the gun 8, well, then I'm just going to treat them as if they open from under the gun 7. And if I'm in on the button, for example, I'm going to respond against that under the gun 8 open the same way I would respond to it under the gun 7, and so on, right? You can move it all the way around the table if you like. If they're crazy wide, you can just move them 2 or 3 positions later and just respond to their open in that sort of a way. That can be your baseline there. Particularly for the big blind, this is really useful because there's nobody left to act behind, so you can always pretty naturally just default to defending tighter or defending wider based on how you think their opening range is going to be shifting. Now, there's a question here: what do you do against an opponent that just limps everything except the top part of the range? Well, the question that I would ask back in return there is, what would be the factors that would contribute to us being able to increase EV against that range, right? If they have a range that doesn't include very strong hands, then first of all, we are not going to be afraid of aggression, right? We're not going to be afraid of getting raised by them, which is a good thing. Second of all, we're going to be able to be much more confident getting chips in with medium to strong hands because we no longer have to worry about being re-aggressed or running into top end of range or anything like that. So these are somewhat unique spots because it's hard to use sims to really figure those out. But the way I would just think about it is if you're dealing with somebody that has an incredibly capped range like that, it's actually very, very straightforward in that all you really have to do is think about the portion of hands that you expect can get action from worse hands in that range. So if they're limping 30% of hands or something super wide, right? Everything that is in your range that has the ability to get action from worse is going to have a substantial reason to just raise over that limp, right? Just apply a lot of pressure. And then everything that maybe has the ability to get better to fold, if you think that they do have folds in that limping range, is also going to have the ability to bluff quite effectively there. So you might have some incentive to be even wider there if there's also hands that you think can get some of those dominating combos to fold by opening there or by raising and applying a lot of pressure. So there do exist both sides of the equation. That it's not just about getting worse to call, but the bottom line is if your opponent just never has a strong hand, you just do not have to be afraid of that range. You can just open extremely wide. You can just apply maximum pressure there. And if anything, the main thing you have to be guarding against when it comes to playing against limpers is not the limping range themselves. It's the players left to act behind. It's the fact that if you go too wide against that limper, then obviously it becomes feasible for the players behind you to really attack your range to some degree more than they usually would. So that is going to be partly a factor. But generally, I think it's easy to overcomplicate playing against limpers, right? Like if someone is telling you, I'm limping, I don't have a good hand, I have a range of very medium to weak kind of hands, you can put a lot of money in against that range, and you should put a lot of money in against that range. You should be playing very aggressively against limpers because they are not going to fight back a lot, right? Mathol, hello, welcome, Raphael. So the equation there against limpers is simpler than it seems. What you will find as well sometimes is that there will be limpers who maybe have slightly weaker tendencies against a raise, like maybe they are limp folding a bit more, and against those players you might add more to the bottom of the range. You might add more hands that benefit a little bit more from folding. But bottom line is, if you're going to get action from worse, if the limpers are going to be playing really passively, playing really just kind of face up, like you just want to get money in the pot against those ranges. You want to put them in a position where you get to play more pots against them. And in particular, you want to make sure that they put in the most money possible while still having a wide range. I think this is a really important point that people miss. It's that you're not trying to make them fold. You're not trying to make them call. You're trying to make them put a lot of money in the pot on the early streets while still having a range that they can't easily defend across multiple streets here. So that's a quite important thing, and a quite useful thing to keep in mind that we can do when it comes to exploiting them or taking advantage of them in that way. Just getting them to put money in the pot in a way where they're going to end up, calling flop, folding turn, folding river, all of these things. They add a lot to our overall EV. So don't overcomplicate it. Don't get caught up in feeling like these limpers have some kind of secret strategy that they're using, because they're just not. Like they're playing face up. Like they have exactly the type of hand that they're telling you they have, and you can just kind of respond accordingly, right? So to go back to thinking a little bit about just basic responses against opening ranges, we have the ability to kind of just shift our opponent around the table a little bit if we think that they're going to be wider or tighter, and we're looking at maybe just adding a position, removing a position, and adapting our approach accordingly. But that's the reactive part, right? That's the reactive part in terms of their initial opening range and it being tighter or wider. Thank you, Hostito. Appreciate it. The next thing is to think about the proactive part of the equation here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to an uneven stack sim. I'm actually going to take just our initial uneven stack sim that we just looked at. And instead of thinking too much about this under the gun spot, because it wasn't the best example to pick to begin with here, what I'm going to do is go through to this situation where we have, let's just reset it. Let's go hijack open. So we open from the hijack here. We're going to open our standard kind of a hijack range. And let's say we have this player in the small blind here, and they are going to 3-bet, right? So we're going to face a 3-bet from the small blind here. And we're going to be trying to think about the response that we might employ. Let's say, first of all, that our opponent is 3-betting a suboptimal strategy in that they are 3-betting too tightly, right? So this is going to be probably the thing that you're going to come up against more often than anything else. What you're immediately going to find is that the the fact that they're 3-betting too tightly is going to obviously reduce the EV of pretty much everything in your opening range, as far as just the EV from continuing. The only exception being the hands that are so strong that they are, trying to get some value here. So it is important to recognize that if they are too tight, then by far the most significant, the most important, the most common thing that we're going to have to do is just simply fold more. Like, there's no getting around that, right? There's no getting away from the fact that if your opponent has a range that is too tight, you just have to fold more. I think the reason people miss that is because they tend to think that if we're folding more, then we're not exploiting them, right? We're not like taking advantage of them in some way. But in reality, it just is that simple. Like, they're supposed to have a range that is wide enough that it incentivizes you to put money in the pot with a lot of hands that are kind of medium strength. But if they're not doing that, then you already made more money from the times that they didn't 3-bet you, that they were supposed to 3-bet you, right? If they don't 3-bet, Jack 8 suited at all here, then every time that they choose not to do that, you don't get put in a tough spot in a circumstance where you're supposed to be put in a tough spot, and you benefit from that, right? So it's not always the case that things have to be super complicated, or that things have to be, involving like calling and trying to play post flop and all these things. Like, in quite a lot of cases, if they're too tight, you just fold more. And in particular, the stuff that's going to be the starting point here is the stuff that's mixing some degree of folding to begin with. So stuff like 9-8 suited, Queen 9 suited, pocket fours, all these hands. If your opponent is too tight with their 3-bets here, if you think that they're missing some of these 3-bet bluffs, then just folding those hands is going to be by far the easiest starting point. The hands that are already on the borderline are just going to shift over the borderline into just pure fold, right? The other thing to be aware of is that there are different things that can happen other than just your opponent being too wide or too tight. And what I mean by that is your opponent can be too linear or too polar with their 3-bets. And if they're too linear, if they are too much, too orientated around having a lot of these like medium to strong hands that are kind of thin value sort of stuff like king queens and hands like that. If they're too linear, then that's going to decrease the EV that we gain from playing post flop, right? There are going to be hands that would normally call and play post flop that no longer want to do that because they're up against a range that includes more sort of thin value type hands. But the hands that 4-bet, or the hands that have the incentive here to shove all in or to 4-bet small, which you can see is a pretty small part of the strategy here, but the hands that are 4-betting, they now have more incentive to do that because we're up against a range that if they have more king queens, more ace jacks, more ace tens, hands like that, those hands are going to have really tough spots against 4-bets. And that actually increases our incentive to be doing more 4-betting, potentially more non-all-in 4-betting in this case, perhaps. So a range that's too linear is going to be vulnerable to 4-bets, but it's not going to be vulnerable against calls. By contrast, a range that is too polar, so a range that maybe they don't have a lot of these suited broadways in there, right? But maybe they, for whatever reason, they just pick a bunch of random offsuit aces and they start to 3-bet those, or they 3-bet some random suited hands as bluffs. Whatever it is, if they're 3-betting too polar in a way where their bluffs are very weak, right? They don't have a lot of, high equity kind of bluffing hands or playable bluffing hands. They have a lot of weak bluffs. That range is one where they are very vulnerable against calls because that range isn't going to have a good time playing post flop. If they have a polar range, we want to force them to try to play that range out of position post flop because that's going to be really tough for them. And what we don't want to do is revert simply to 4-betting or folding because that's making life easy for them, right? If they have a polar range, they have a range of hands that has easy decisions against a 4-bet. So naturally, the adaptation that's going to make the most sense there is not to 4-bet that often and instead to prioritize just flatting and calling with a lot of hands that are going to force that polar range to play post-flop more often. And this is exactly what you'll see if you look at sims where you've got a response against a big blind 3-bet. You won't see very much flatting against you won't see very much 4-betting against a big blind 3-bet. You'll see a lot of flatting because big blind 3-bets are going to be more polar naturally, and that means the best response is to force that range to play post-flop out of position. So that's an important part of the whole equation there, whether they're too linear, too polar, and obviously it's possible for them to be, too linear and too tight, or too polar but also too tight, and these are different variables that can contribute in different ways. But generally speaking, the key thing here is to kind of keep an eye on what types of hands are going to exist within that range, and to sort of construct our response accordingly. But of course, if the range does get too tight, we're just going to have to start to fold more. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is, of course, there are certain hands in this range that are shoving all in simply for, basic fold equity. And in order to kind of increase villain's incentive to call it off a little bit wider, like the ace-4 suited here, right? Ace-3 suited even a little bit, ace-5 a little bit. These hands have quite an important role in our range in that they do get a lot of folds when they shove. They get folds from all of these broadways that they're unblocking and things like that. But they also, like I say, serve to give villain an incentive to call it off with a hand like nines here, right? When they 3-bet nines, they have an incentive to call off now. If villain is not going to, let's say, call it off with those hands, right? Then the EV of shoving these combos is actually going to get better, because we're going to be getting folds that we're not supposed to get, right? We're going to see an increase in EV from shoving there. However, if villain is not 3-betting those hands in the first place, the EV is going to go way down. So we have to be really clear on, do we think that villain is 3-betting them, but then they're not calling off with them? Or are they not 3-betting them to begin with? Because it's the gap between the 3-bet range and the call-off range that is the thing that is exploitable here, right? It's that gap, that change between what they're 3-betting and what they're calling off is the area that's potentially open to some kind of an exploit. And similarly, the other hands in our range that are shoving here, hands like ace-king off, hands like queens, jacks, tens, those are obviously hands that are shoving for value because they are a bit vulnerable, but they're strong enough to really get stacks in. But again, these are hands that if we are not getting action from, let's say we have jacks, right? If we're shoving jacks here at equilibrium, if we're not getting action from tens and nines, if villain is not 3-bet calling off tens and nines, then there's no reason to shove jacks anymore. Because the only benefit that jacks gets from shoving is the ability to get worse hands to call, right? That's the main benefit of shoving. And in particular, you don't really gain anything from shoving if you would have the ability to play post-flop against tens or nines in position if you called, but if you shove, those hands are just going to fold. Like, that becomes kind of a problem, becomes actually a detriment to our EV. So that's quite an important thing to be aware of there. Now, there's one other general area that I want to kind of pay attention to here, and it relates to specifically what happens when we get into these big pot confrontations at deep stacks. Because you'll quite often see players do things like, let's say we look at like 100 big blinds, even stacks. Let's say it's like low jack against cutoff, right? So something happens where we open low jack, cutoff 3-bets. And then if we look at what our response is going to be in terms of a 4-bet, you can immediately see already that our 4-bet range is basically just composed of kings, aces, and ace-king kind of as the value portion, and then a variety of other hands kind of with low frequencies. But what's quite important to realize is that in response to that, villain is not supposed to shove aces, right? They're not supposed to just be all in with aces. The reason being that they have a pretty big incentive to try to keep our bluffs in our range, right? They want us to still be able to have all these suited ace bluffs that they're absolutely crushing, absolutely dominating. Same thing with ace king suited. And in fact, same thing with queens, jacks, tens. Those hands benefit from playing in position here at 100 big blinds deep. They don't really benefit from reopening the action and trying to be all in. So even though a hand like ace king off, a hand like ace king suited, kings, hands like that are clearly hands that benefit a lot from 4-betting. If we look at what happens when they actually shove and what we're calling off with, we're supposed to be calling off with tens plus and ace king here because of the fact that villain has a lot of ace king in their shoving range. But it's quite important to realize that if they are, let's say they, instead of trapping with aces, if they now decide to shove with aces and they decide to shove with ace king suited, then that's going to change their shoving range quite a bit. And it's really going to put us in a position where calling it off with ace king off in our situation might actually not be very good, right? That 7.83 big blinds that we're making by calling it off with ace king off is going to get a lot lower if they are actually shoving with aces and shoving with queens and shoving with ace king suited instead of just shoving with ace king off and pocket kings and not really much else. And the same goes for, jacks and tens. Calling it off here, 4-betting and calling it off with jacks is only supposed to make about 1.5 big blinds to begin with. And if our opponent suddenly starts shoving with aces pre-flop because they're just too excited to get it in and they're not going to trap and call a 4-bet and try to play post-flop, then it's now going to be a huge punt to get it in with jacks or a huge punt to get it in with tens here, right? We're just not going to have much reason to do that at all. So there's quite a lot of incentive for us to really think carefully about what hands we 4-bet with in these deep stack situations against players that are not going to be playing optimally. Just because we can get into so many bad spots. And I do feel like players lose sight of the fact that what it really comes down to is 4-betting is something that we do primarily because we either have the ability to get better hands to fold or the ability to get worse hands to call. And you can see that queens is not even a pure 4-bet in general here, but it becomes especially damaging to 4-bet queens if, number one, you can't call off because you're getting shoved on by aces and ace king and stuff like that, so you're going to have to fold if they 5-bet shove anyway. And number two, if they don't have hands like, these suited connector hands, these pocket pair hands, these suited Broadway hands, if they don't have all those hands that are flatting the 4-bet here in the first place, then there's even less reason to 4-bet a hand like queens, even less reason to 4-bet a hand like jacks, and so on, right? We would want to be probably more orientated around just 4-bet bluffing with some of these suited ace hands to block those very, very strong hands, and we wouldn't really be so preoccupied with hands like ace queen off, queens, jacks that are kind of these value 4-bets that are benefiting from the stuff that's going to flat and play post-flop. So we always, like I said, have to keep our eye on the basic principles there of how EV is actually transferring between one player and another, how we're benefiting or not benefiting from a player that is making some deviations here compared to an optimal strategy. Now, I want to put in a couple of reps on the trainer. I want to just kind of show you guys a little bit of how we might employ some of these ideas. Let me get rid of that blur effect because I have that in place to not see our hole cards. I'm going to just quickly create a drill here, common spots. We're going to be pre-flop. We're going to be facing a raise. We're going to be playing in any position against any position at, let's say, 60 big blinds, right? So we're just going to look at that one in fairly simple terms. I can get rid of the blur here, edit blur. Sorry, I use this for coaching purposes. When I'm doing a coaching session with someone and I'm running trainer drills with them, like we'll hide the hole cards to talk about the general aspects of the spot. So this is an example of a great situation where we quite often will find exploits that we can employ here, right? Because one thing to note is that it's probably going to be the case here at equilibrium that sixes is going to mix some small frequency of 3-bets in a lot of cases like this. You will find some of these pocket pairs, these medium pocket pairs, doing a tiny bit of 3-betting. Now, if we thought that our opponent was going to be opening a bit too tight, then, you know, we would, again, treat this as if it was maybe a low jack open or an under the gun 7 open. So we would take our baseline as being the response against under the gun 7 or response against low jack from the small blind. And then from that baseline, if we think maybe not only are they opening a bit too tight, but they're also going to be, you know, folding less often to 3-bets as a result, then the way that we want to think about a hand like sixes is, if they're folding to 3-bets less often, does that benefit sixes 3-betting or does it not, right? And I think in most cases it probably wouldn't, because the hands that they call a 3-bet with are unlikely to be dominated by sixes to begin with. There are some small pocket pairs in there, obviously, but there's not that many of them. And sixes is just flipping against a lot of hands. It's not going to play that well out of position in a 3-bet pot. So generally speaking, if they are a little bit tight against the 3-bet, it's going to increase our incentive. Well, it's going to decrease our incentive to 3-bet in the first place. And the next thing becomes, well, should we call instead? And I think it quite clearly becomes a case of yes, because even though sixes is not going to play that well in a 3-bet pot, it is going to play fine in a single raise pot, even if our opponent is, you know, making some errors here on the tighter side. So they're opening a little bit tighter. We're not going to fold sixes, but we're also not going to 3-bet it. 6-7 is a clear fold right there. This is another good example, actually. So this is one where probably queen 4 off going to be pretty borderline against the cutoff open. I think it's going to be towards the bottom of the stuff that's going to defend. If our opponent was opening too wide, then we would just treat this like a button open. If they were opening too tight, we would treat it like a hijack or a low jack open, in which case queen 4 off might start to fold. If they are folding a bit too much to the 3-bet here, then if queen 4 off is mixing a small frequency of 3-bets at equilibrium here, which is probably not, don't think we're going to 3-bet a queen blocker very often here, then we might decide to increase our willingness to 3-bet this type of hand. But it's going to be quite hard for our opponent to be folding so much that a hand like queen 4 off goes from never 3-betting to now it becomes a 3-bet, or now it becomes an easy 3-bet. So mostly it's probably going to be the case that it's hard for our opponent to be making so many mistakes that we can suddenly play this hand differently. So I think I'm going to hit call, because that's what the sim is going to want. Okay, it's mixing call and fold. Yeah, right on the borderline. I don't think there's really very much that could happen here as far as villain's response that could incentivize us to 3-bet this hand. I think generally we're just going to want to call or fold. And if they were a bit tighter, we would fold. If they were a bit looser, we would probably just pure call. Now we have, this is another one, another really good, interesting one. We have pocket 8s here in under the gun 7 position. This one is probably going to mix at least some small frequency of 3-bets at equilibrium as well. If our opponent is a little bit too tight, I think that is going to push us towards not 3-betting this hand, because again, this hand is supposed to get a bit of action from some worse hands, which is one of the reasons to 3-bet it. But if we're not getting that action, now we probably just prefer to call. The other thing that's quite notable here is players will, this is a great example of a spot where players will 3-bet because they don't want to play multi-way, right? And I think it's really important to recognize that avoiding a certain type of situation isn't something you need to put isn't something that needs to be part of your strategy. You don't need to think about avoiding multi-way here, because if multi-way play is going to happen a lot, if they're going to call a lot once you call here, that inherently means that they have to be making a lot of mistakes, because it's not optimal to call a lot here once you call. So why would we want to stop them from making mistakes, right? We want them to make those mistakes. We want them to continue in the pot with hands that they should not be in there with. So if anything, the possibility of a lot of multi-way play and players making mistakes behind us here is actually more incentivizing us to flat here, not less. So I think flat would definitely become the clear option here. We do actually go 3 ways, or we get called by the cutoff, and then we get 3-bet by the small blind. This is another really good example of a situation where we can make a pretty reasonable deviation here. If our opponent is playing optimally, then 8s is probably going to be a hand that at least, most players are going to at least like kind of be tempted to just rip it here because you see 19 big blinds in the pot and you're like, oh man, there's so much out there. We have a pocket pair, all that sort of stuff. I think a lot of opponents are going to be too tight here. We are in position, so I do think it's reasonable to expect that given the price that we're getting, it probably would not be... I don't think it would be very easy for this to suddenly become a fold here. I mean, I don't know. I'm going to hit call. It might be a... Yeah, okay, so I'm... Okay, so I wasn't wrong. I'm glad I didn't punt here. So the first decision, yeah, it's a mix. Second decision, it is also a mix here. So, that's the cutoff. Okay, where are we? Okay, so... Oh, okay, so yeah, I was kind of accurate here. So I thought this would kind of be a mix against the small blind. I thought that, we'd be in a position where eights is kind of awkward here. I do think that players being tighter, like I say, it's going to shift us possibly towards the territory where it's folding, but it may not, just because if it's going to be a tighter range here, then we're actually going to win more when we flop a set. So it's going to be a little bit better for us. But there are other hands in this flatting range, like let's say tiny shreds of like Jack 10 suited or stuff like King 10 suited. That's the stuff that against a player who's not squeezing enough here, which is going to be most players. That's the stuff that would benefit from just folding instead, and wouldn't really have much incentive to get super out of line there. Let's do a couple more. 4-5 off. This one's just going to be pure fold no matter what. 5-7 suited. This is another good, interesting example. This one's going to be pretty, I think, borderline in an equilibrium sense. I think it's going to be kind of on the cusp of probably putting some money in the pot here, but maybe not always. It's probably quite hard for a circumstance to exist where we would have a reason to 3-bet this hand, simply because the hijack would have to be maybe opening a bit wider than normal, but also they would have to be probably folding quite a lot to that 3-bet, just because 5-7 suited is a weak hand. We're only really going to gain any significant EV from 3-betting this hand if we think that we can get some folds from some better combos right now, and or if we feel like Villain's going to make so many mistakes post flop that we just are super happy to play pots against them. But generally speaking, probably quite hard to imagine a circumstance where this hand becomes much of a 3-bet. Yeah, it is mixed call and fold, right? You can see it's not really going to have too much incentive to 3-bet here. There's some 3-betting going on with some of the medium suited hands and some of the suited connectors that are not the one-gappers here, but these suited one-gappers, they tend to be kind of okay as calls in various spots, but they're not really going to be good 3-bets a lot of the time just because they don't have good properties for that. Jack 10 off. This is another one, hijack versus small blind. This is another good example of a situation where it's probably reasonably unlikely that our hand is ever really going to have particularly good properties for 3-betting. It's not really very likely that we're going to be able to get much action from worse. It's also not that likely that we can get a lot of better hands to fold. And even when we do, we don't have good playability post-flop if we do get called. But if our opponent is perhaps a little on the wide side, or if our opponent is potentially playing too passively post-flop, that then could be an incentive for this hand to just always call here. And it is a low-frequency call to begin with, but it certainly could be the case that we would want to just pure call, 100% call here against a player that we think is going to make some mistakes post-flop. This one, 8-9 off. That one's just going to be pure fold no matter what. And it is worth noting that a lot of hands you do just have to fold. Like, there's not really anything you can do in some circumstances. All right. Under the gun 8 open. This is another one where if they were opening under the gun 9 or something, or if they were tighter than optimal, then a lot of hands from this big blind defense range would start to shift out of there. We would just fold them. But Queen Jack off is going to be pretty squarely in that calling range. You can see it's 100% call here. Probably really hard for our opponent to be doing anything that would cause us to somehow play this hand differently. Probably not really ever going to be any reason to 3-bet it. Not really going to be much reason to fold it. So, again, there are a lot of situations where there just isn't any incentive for us to actually play a hand differently, because based on the actual properties of that hand, it's not going to gain or lose any EV to the extent where we have an incentive to play it differently. You know, the stuff that's on the borderline, yeah, we probably do, but this is not borderline. This one's another good one, actually. If under the gun 8 opens here and we think that this open is a little bit too tight, then we might be in a position where it's harder for us to get as much value from pocket jacks, and therefore we might default towards just calling, because this is going to be a mix in theory. But conversely, if villain was too wide, or if they were, maybe they're just never 4-bet bluffing, which is a common thing, or they just are calling 3-bets too often, then now we would have, you know, maybe a much bigger incentive to 3-bet. Now we do 3-bet and we do get shoved on. It's worth noting that it is possible for something to happen that can turn this into a fold, right? It is possible that our opponent can be flatting a 3-bet really wide, and therefore we gain a lot of EV from 3-betting. But when they actually do 4-bet like this, you know, they pretty much just have it. And that can generate a circumstance where we might 3-bet fold a hand like jacks. But that's relatively rare. Most of the time, it's quite hard to imagine a player playing in such a way where we can 3-bet a lot of hands for value, being confident that we're getting action from worse by calls, but once they 4-bet, we're like, oh, they just have a really good hand now, right? So usually we're not going to really want to put ourselves in too many of these spots. We're not going to really want to be in situations like that where we kind of are forced to make this decision or fold away this equity. So we might want to flat preflop instead here. But if we are getting a lot of value from the calls, then we can still 3-bet. Is there any merit to 3-betting cutoff to get button to fold preflop? Not really. It's a very, very minor factor. Simply because the player that's already in the pot, that's already invested money in the pot, is significantly more important than any of the players left to act behind. Because the players left to act behind they're going to fold like 80% of the time no matter what, right? They're just not going to be in the pot very often. So anytime we start to like 3-bet to because of something related to somebody that's left to act behind, like it's the same as not calling because we don't want to go multi-way or whatever. It's just not going to happen that frequently to the point where we have to worry about it. And if it was happening that frequently, if the button had, like, let's say hypothetically, if we knew that when we flat in the cutoff, the button is going to call 100% of hands, then we should flat. Like, we should let them call with a bunch of garbage. Like, don't force them to fold bad hands. Let them call bad hands, right? So yeah, just not really a thing, not really something you have to worry about because of the fact that the button is just never going to be in the pot that often. And if they were, then it would mean that they were in the pot with hands they shouldn't be, and that's a good thing, right? So your strategy is built off of the player or players that are already in the pot or that have already invested money in the pot, not the players that are left to act behind. It's the same in the small blind. We don't 3-bet to get the big blind to fold or to get it heads up or anything like that. We 3-bet because of the properties of our hand versus the original raising range. So we're going to call with jacks here in equilibrium. We obviously will lose a flip to ace king, but if villain was not shoving the hands that they're supposed to shove here, you know, you can see that they're supposed to only really shove kings and ace king at some frequency. That allows us to call off with jacks because ace king off is more common, but generally, if they weren't shoving those hands, if they were shoving more kings and queens and less ace king or something of that kind of area, if they were starting to shove aces and stuff, then we would just fold jacks. But you can see that they're also supposed to call a lot of hands here against this 3-bet. They're supposed to give us a bunch of action and let us get some value there. And again, if they don't do that, then also that would be decreasing the EV of 3-betting with jacks in the first place. So I think that is a good spot to kind of wrap the discussion here. Obviously, we jumped around a lot between ideas. I think the main thing to keep an eye on and to kind of be aware of is just those basic principles of how EV is transferred between players. If we're getting worse to call, if we're getting action from worse, then we should do that. You know, we should try to get that action from worse. If we're getting better hands to fold, we should try to do that. especially if our hand still has a bit of sort of backup playability and backup equity if we get flatted. But if we don't have the ability to do either of those two things, then it's pretty rare that we're going to have much incentive to really invest money in a pot, other than potentially having the ability to play passively or call in certain circumstances. And then we also kind of covered that when we're dealing with players who are maybe a bit too loose or a bit too tight with their opening ranges, we can just shift them around one or two positions, which is quite helpful. And of course, if we're dealing with limpers, then we really just have to focus on the fact that we're not really scared of them. We're not really scared of the range that they might have, and we're just going to be able to apply a lot of pressure with various different types of hands, but kind of primarily focused on a little bit of that getting thin value with some hands that can get action from worse. It's going to be an important part of it. And then we also talked a little bit about the idea of how our opponent's range is actually constructed, whether it's too polar, too linear. Those factors are going to contribute to whether or not we have more of an incentive to try to play more post-flop against them or less post-flop against them, and whether we try to do more 4-betting or less 4-betting. So all of that stuff is an important consideration. I would encourage you guys, if you have the ability to do so, play around with running your own sims in preflop solvers. It is really powerful, and it is really interesting and useful if you're the kind of person like me who enjoys diving into solves and nerding out over the outputs. I will teach you a lot, and there's always different ways to kind of explore different situations and solutions that can be really helpful. So I think that is a valuable thing for anybody who's out there playing against really weak opponents, because you really can solve these situations. You can solve spots for playing against non-GTO opponents. You just have to know how to actually do it. So that's quite an important thing to get to learn if you're playing a lot in these environments. So I think that's going to be it for me. If nobody else has any more questions, thank you everybody for being here. A lot more people here today than we got last week, which is great. I'm going to continue posting a poll every week in our Discord server for those of you who are in that server and want to contribute and choose the topics. No worries. Thanks, Hostito. Appreciate it. If you want to vote on what the topic will be for next time, I will post the poll for next week in the Discord right now. I will also, while I'm at it, is that the Discord? That is the Discord. Let's move that over. I'm also going to post a link to the Discord. I'm going to post a server invite in the, where are we? Copy. I'm going to post the link in the chat right there. For those of you who are not in the Discord already, go ahead and get yourself in there, and we will post I will post the poll for next week's topic in the stream announcements channel very shortly. I will hopefully see you guys again very soon as well, because I will be back next week. So no change in the schedule. I will be back at 10 a.m. next Friday. So thanks everybody. I look forward to finding out what you guys are going to vote for next week's session. But I'll see you guys soon, and good luck at the tables if you're going to be playing. Thanks.